Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming tonight. Again, I am Allysah Fox, and this project is near and dear to me. I've been working on it with my then supervisor. She actually just retired this past June, and she worked on it for decades. I worked on it for about 5 years. And so I helped a lot with the development of the interactive feature that's available on our website right now. And so I'm going to talk more about that. And then my coworker, Karl is going to talk about history.
Hello. So to understand the story of Lewis Mountain and the story of segregation within Shenandoah National Park, we have to go through the timeline as it happened. So as Allysah just mentioned, halfway through, we're going to transition and look at the interactive feature that Shenandoah has online as our website that we use with school groups as well, public groups, to be able to bring that story more to life. But the reason why I'm here, another thing that Shenandoah National Park does to preserve this story is giving public programs. So throughout the summer and fall months, maybe some of you have attended a ranger program or 2 or 10. And one of those that we give every Friday at Lewis Mountain Campground, the site of our story, we give that history. Now, before I start with the timeline, before I start with the story as we saw it then and as we tell it now, it's always good to preface that me, Ranger Karl, Ranger Allysah, we cannot relate to this story. But as park rangers, the mission of the National Park Service, when it came into effect in 1916, stated we were to set out to preserve unimpaired natural and cultural resources and values for this and for future generations. So what that means is Allysah and myself are here to tell the story as we know it, fact, but any emotion tied to that is all left to you folks. Now, another thing that Allysah is going to do for me is she's going to be the clicker for my PowerPoint. So how many of you here have visited Shenandoah National Park? I'm sure, probably more than once. Have any of you been to Lewis Mountain Campground? Have any of you spent the night at Lewis Mountain Campground? Beautiful area, beautiful, historic, nice, quiet, remote section of the park. And it's one of my favorite places when I do stay within the park boundary. Now, the thing about Shenandoah National Park, and the reason why all of you raised your hands, is because we were set aside as a national park. The purpose of Shenandoah was to be accessible. Back in those days, of course, if you were here last week, I went through the whole rigmarole, everything related to Shenandoah as quickly as possible, because there's a lot. But prior to Shenandoah opening its doors, the one national park in the east was Acadia, which is still like 13 hours north of here. So even back then, back in the 19-teens, 1920s, if you were going to a national park, you were spending a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money to go out and experience that beautiful natural cultural resource. Well, in the 1920s, they got this idea to bring about an Eastern park in Western tradition. Eastern Park, Western tradition. I know for those of you who returned from last week, I asked this same question. I love this question because it's always a different answer. What does that mean to you folks? An Eastern Park in Western tradition.
Big.
Big. Sure. Anything else?
Rustic.
Rustic. I like that. Big trees, beautiful lodges, rustic experience. Absolutely. Because up until 1935, when we opened our doors, and along with us, Great Smokies and Mammoth Cave also joined the fray. But if you wanted that rustic, that big, that wilderness experience, you were heading west or to Acadia. So we wanted a national park accessible to the millions of people that lived in the eastern United States. The banner over the park read, "Within a mile of millions," because that's where the people were. And we opened our doors to be accessible. Here's a great picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, president at the time, during our commemoration ceremony in July of 1936 in his motorcade driving through Big Meadows. So again, That was our whole purpose, to be accessible. Now, if you are an early park visitor, again, 1936, 1938, whenever you might have visited, this is what you would experience. You'd come in, one of the entrance stations, usually there was going to be a restaurant there. There was one at Thornton Gap, one at Swift Run Gap that no longer stand. There were 2 visitor center information naturalist areas. There were 2 big resorts. Even prior to us opening our doors, Skyland Lodge, what is now Skyland Lodge, was a big affluent resort for East Coast artists and politicians. Big Meadows had a hotel there as well. You had waysides or general stores. You had comfort stations. You had all of these great amenities, picnic areas, campgrounds, places to stay, places to recreate, places to experience that Western traditional park. If you were an African American citizen, none of these were going to be available to you. Now, when we first opened our doors, and I'll have you click next. Again, when we first opened our doors, we wanted to be available and accessible to everybody that was out there, regardless of creed, regardless of background, regardless of ethnicity. But as you'll see, there were a lot of different factors that were playing into the story as a whole. So when we opened our doors in 1936, the park was set up to be segregated. And this is because the quote that just popped up is from the associate director of the National Park Service at the time, a gentleman by the name of Arthur Desmarais. And as he said, despite this being a federal park, federal land, it was to follow the program of development of facilities. Were going to be separate facilities for white and colored people to the extent as necessary to conform with the generally held customs, generally accepted customs long established in Virginia. Because remember, this is 1930s in the South. But what exactly is it that laid the groundwork? I know you folks, I'm sure, are very familiar with the history of civil rights. So I'm going to boil a lot of stuff down into a very small time frame because the Civil War ended in 1865. Immediately after that, formerly enslaved people or those with that family history, African Americans, were pushing for equal rights. First and foremost, they wanted to be formally and federally recognized as citizens of the United States. The war is over. The Union, the things that were stood for in that, things related to slavery, things related to equality, things related to the future civil rights movement were now in place. That ball was rolling, and they wanted these rights. So 1866, we have the very first Civil Rights Act. Now, what this act did was kind of lay the groundwork for rights with a caveat. Back in those days, that kind of laid the groundwork for what we now refer to as Jim Crow legislation. This is, they are now deemed citizens. African American people, formerly enslaved individuals, are now deemed citizens, but again with a caveat. It's not quite the same. Time goes on, 1875, there's another Civil Rights Act, and this lays out the now well-known separate but equal. And that was solidified legally in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. If you're unfamiliar, Homer Plessy was an African-American man on a train ride who refused to sit in the colored section or in the colored car. It was taken to court, Plessy v. Ferguson. What that decided on is the federal government agreed that separate but equal when it comes to public facilities like hotels, like restaurants, like bus stops and train stations, as long as colored people and white people both had facilities and they were deemed equal, it was legal. It was constitutional. So that, again, a lot of stuff boiled down to very, very quick facts, but that lays the groundwork for the newly opened national park in 1935. Because, again, it is a federal land within an area that follows their generally accepted customs of Jim Crow legislation of separate but equal. And this was a big question of what was this new national park to do? here we look at two of the big players in our story, and I'll just briefly mention them. You'll notice I mentioned these names quite a bit during the rest of this timeline. On the left is Governor of Virginia at the time, Harry F. Byrd Sr. The thing about him, he was very staunchly opposed to integration. He was a big supporter of separate but equal, big supporter of segregation, but also huge supporter of the national park. He was actually one of the primary kind of frontline leaders of raising the funds by the state to give to the National Park Service to open the doors as a national park. So if not for that governor, regardless of how we currently view his ideals or his platforms, regardless of that, the fact is that he was a big proponent of the national park beginning. On the right is the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. Now, the thing about Ickes, he was very progressive, even by today's standards, especially by the standards of then. Harold Ickes was a big supporter of civil rights, big supporter of African American rights. He was active with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, prior to becoming Secretary of the Interior. So he is going to be a big name in the story because from day one, he insisted that there were facilities welcoming to African Americans. However, these two men, they, of course, politically were at odds. They had, of course, a lot of disagreeing ideals, but Harold Ickes was also concerned that if Shenandoah National Park did not follow the customs of segregation at the time, it would become what he referred to as a legislative island. That is, an island of integration surrounded by segregation. And what does that mean for the public? Would there be protests? Would there be conflict? He didn't know, and he didn't want to risk that. So he agreed to the terms of having a segregated spot. That, of course, brings about the Lewis Mountain Negro area as it was labeled at the time. And this landscape, of course, was meant to be a picnic grounds welcoming to African Americans, a picnic grounds that was segregated, yes, but a place for them to come recreate safely and appropriately within the confines of what the state and the federal government deemed necessary. Now, the only thing is that in 1939, a federal solicitor, a lawyer of the government, came out to assess the facilities within Shenandoah National Park. However, when he got to Lewis Mountain picnic area and campground, what he found is, yes, it is separate. It's separate from the other picnic grounds, separate from the other campgrounds, but there weren't any picnic tables. There weren't any fire rings. There weren't any shelters. There weren't any tent pads, camp spots. There were no cabins. There was really no facility other than an open space. Separate, but was it equal? Harold Ickes got wind. He, of course, kind of brought the hammer down. He said, after reading this report, I demand that work be done to bring about equal facilities. So that report was filed January of 1939. Starting later that year, in March of the same year, all of a sudden, stuff is going up. Tables are being brought out. By the end of 1940, there was going to be cabins. There was going to be a restaurant, what we now know as the Lewis Mountain Wayside. It was going to be a place that actually could accommodate. And much of that landscape, if you've stayed up there, if you visited Lewis Mountain, again, beautiful camp spot, it remains largely unchanged since 1940 when those amenities were put in place. So, of course, you see the now 1940 amenities, one of the cabins there, a nice camp spot as well. Now, with that, there's another player at hand that was going to bring about a little bit of conflict, a little bit of opposition. So even still to this day, Shenandoah National Park, no national park is run solely by the National Park Service. A lot of the operations of the facilities, the hotels, the restaurants, the general stores, the gas stations are going to be run by a contracted concessions company. And the contracted concessions company at the time was the Virginia Skyline company. And this, again, is going to be kind of a source of opposition to Harold Ickes and what he was hoping to do at the time. Now, what's interesting is in 1939, again, Ickes gets wind of these facilities not being quite up to snuff with what he envisioned. He's pushing for facilities to be brought about, pushing for a restaurant to be opened. But on top of that, and what we'll talk more on in a couple more minutes, is that he's trying to make changes throughout the rest of the park too. He's trying to integrate these other areas, but more on that in a moment. The Virginia Skyline Company, the CEO says, why are we doing this? Why are we putting in these facilities? As I can see it, it's a waste of money. It's a waste of effort. Because what he was going off of, he believed, or at least how he told the federal government at the time, he didn't believe African Americans wanted to recreate within Shenandoah National Park because they didn't seem interested in any other facility in the park. So you notice something there. He said this is a waste of time and money because they're not interested in recreating. And again, other players here, another name you'll hear a few more times in this story, the superintendent of the park at the time, a gentleman by the name of Ralph Lassiter, he was also concerned. He was nervous that bringing about these facilities is just going to encourage more of that travel by African Americans, and that could just inherently could bring about conflict within his park. And he was very, very skeptical, very nervous of this whole thing. Now, the director of the National Park Service at the time, Arno Kammerer, he insisted on this change as well for a slightly different reason than Harold Ickes. He was concerned that if he didn't appease and bring about these facilities, that it could lead to other future demands. So again, you notice there's a lot of these different players, a lot of these different thoughts and ideas and ideals for very different reasons. Not all of them are nebulous. Not all of them are from a necessarily bad place or anything, but they're from a very hesitant place. Again, remember the time. But in 1940, the facilities properly opened. There's a restaurant, there's camping, there's lodging, and now there's people hired to manage it. So who we're looking at here was a married couple. That's going to be Lloyd Tutt and his wife Amelia, or Mitty Tutt. And they really did a lot of good for this landscape. And there was really a heyday for Lewis Mountain, despite the opposition they saw, despite the people who were concerned that it wasn't going to be a success. Now, the thing is, Lloyd and Amelia, they knew the area well. Lloyd had previously worked within what is now Shenandoah National Park back before it was even a national park. Back when President Herbert Hoover had his Rapidan camp, his presidential retreat, Lloyd actually worked as a cook at one of those facilities. So he knew the landscape, he knew the mountain. And now this facility is open and him and his wife Amelia are the sole operators of it. Now, what's interesting is they really got to make it what they want, despite what they were told. In an interview with Lloyd later on, and we have this on our website. So we have a variety of oral histories documented on our website. One of those from 1970 with Lloyd Tutt, and within that, he describes the place as really kind of a fun spot. As he said, the joint was jumping. They had a piano, they had a Nickelodeon, which we come to see as probably a player piano or possibly even a jukebox. And so there was dancing and music every night. Oftentimes entertainers would come out. They would sing for us. They would perform for us. After dinner each evening, they would clear the floor and have guided dances on the hardwood floors there in the main lobby. Now, Lloyd was actually kind of ordered by the superintendent that he was not to accommodate white visitors that asked to stay. If all other campgrounds were filled up, no room at the hotel, and you're a Caucasian visitor and you want to stay at Lewis Mountain, you were supposed to be turned away. If he could help it, Floyd never did. Which is interesting because already we're seeing kind of what's to come. After hours, the sun goes down, and Lewis Mountain, this segregated spot, this isolated island within the national park, is actually truly integrated, but the park doesn't know about it because it's going against what was originally planned. Now, this became a very, very popular site for obvious reasons. First and foremost, if you were a traveler to the southern states, if you were an African American, regardless of where you were coming from, you were going to be very familiar with this book on the left. Is anybody here familiar with the history of the Green Book? What was the Green Book?
It was the book for the Negroes of places they could stay that were safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of the Green Book as, I think of it as a hiking map, right? I'm a park ranger. I think of it as a hiking map. If I'm going to the park, I want to stretch my legs out in that beautiful wilderness. I want to know where it's safe for me to go. What's the elevation? What's the distance? What's the condition of the trail? What am I going to encounter? That's exactly what the Green Book was. If you were traveling throughout the South, this could be a family, or maybe you're an entertainer, you're going on tour throughout the southern states, you're going to have that book in hand because this is going to tell you what restaurants you're welcome at, what hotels will accommodate you, and even what private homes, what citizens will welcome you in for a stay for a fee. Lewis Mountain Campground at Shenandoah National Park was listed in the Green Book. So it was well known to people even outside of Virginia. Now, on top of that, locals loved it as a spot that they were welcome to. You folks are locals to here. I'm sure you're very familiar with the history of your home. Myself and Ranger Alley, we're from Page County. Luray area is where I live. And back in those days, there was a segregated part of town. It was called the Hill. So segregation was nothing new to the locals around here. But if they wanted to go out for a family picnic, they knew that Lewis Mountain campground and picnic area up in the park would welcome them. So it became a popular spot, not just for travelers, but for locals as well. And it remained popular even well after the park was desegregated. It remained a popular spot for church groups to have potlucks after service, for family events, for these educational tours. They bring a busload up and come and enjoy the nature of the park, have a nice shindig at Lewis Mountain, accommodated by Lloyd and Amelia. Now, of course, the wheel of time keeps turning. This is 1940. Going forward, as I mentioned before, in 1939, Harold Ickes was trying to make some other maybe smaller changes. Of course, Lewis Mountain is the obvious one, but we have some other picnic areas. Pinnacle's Picnic Ground was one that he insisted on integrating. There were 2 restaurants as well that he insisted on opening seating for African American visitors, because up until this time, if you were an African American family traveling through the park, you could order out from a restaurant. You could not dine in seating, but you could order food to go and then sit outside at the table for the staff. Because surprise, surprise, a lot of the employees of the hotels were African American. They could not dine in at their own facilities. The same was for those families, was for those visiting citizens as well. But now Harold Ickes is pushing for these integrated areas. In 1940, the newly appointed director of the Park Service, is now pushing to remove any indication of segregation, colored terminology, Negro, segregated, integrated, remove all of that from park publication. Now the superintendent, Ralph Lassiter, again, he's a little jumpy. He's nervous by all these changes. I mean, integrating another picnic area, we have Lewis Mountain. Why are we integrating another picnic area? As he said, he was afraid that there again was going to be conflict. There was going to be the white visitors, African American visitors at odds because of this integration. Well, while the park rangers were left to be the ones to enforce, as far as we know, conflicts were few and far between, if ever there was any. In 1940, when they were pushing for removal of all of this park literature, removal of the signage of colored versus white. Again, Lassiter spoke up, as you see in the quote here, is, "I still don't understand how a Negro is to know there's a place in the park for him if we're afraid to publish that as fact. How will they know to come here if we don't list it as segregated?" Additionally, in this letter to the director of the Park Service, again coming from Lassiter, is that I believe that we need more and bigger for white-only signage. Not only did he say, let's not remove it, how about, here's a crazy thought, how about we have more of it, because he was so concerned of this conflict. Well, getting into 1941, Washington is really pushing for this integration. Harold Ickes would later, it would be read in his diary, that he described Shenandoah as a race relations laboratory. The thing is, he's in DC. If you think about it, he's a little unaffected by all of this, right? He's not in Page County. He's not down in these areas. He's not in the park if there is conflict. So he's kind of up there moving pawns around and saying, well, let's see what happens. Getting into 1942, we come to a bit of a standstill. World War II happens. That's a pretty big event. Not only are people off and out of the country fighting in the efforts, but also gas and fuel is being rationed. People don't have as much money. People aren't traveling. During that 3-year time period, 1942 to 45, a lot of the park facilities are actually fully closed to the public just because there's not a lot of that demand. So during this time, Ickes is kind of hoping to make some big changes. And they were anticipating coming out of the war, we were probably going to be really busy. Already at this time, being within a mile of millions, Shenandoah National Park is the first national park to reach 1 million visitors in a calendar year. It's a big, big deal. It's a popular spot, right? Now it's been closed for multiple years, but we've won the war. V-Day comes. 1946, we're expecting the floodgates to open. And Harold Ickes is insistent that we fully integrate. All of the park desegregated. There's no Lewis Mountain separate. All of the facilities, restaurants, hotels, you name it, fully desegregated. Virginia Skyline Company, the CEO didn't like that. They said, if you do that, if you push to desegregate my facilities, I'm pulling my contract. This is leading up to the summer. I don't know about you folks. We get a lot of tourist dollars down in our communities during the busy summer and fall months. If the concessions closes the hotels and campgrounds and restaurants right before what could be the busiest summer season post-war, that's going to be a big issue. So they actually delayed. In 1947, the CEO retired, and later that year, they started rolling out this true full desegregation. Over the next several years, every facility within the park is open to all, regardless of ethnicity. Another federal solicitor comes to write a report, 1950. And what he writes to Washington is that he sees zero segregation within Shenandoah National Park. Now that's 1950. Civil rights movement. When did that take place? When was MLK? 1965. 1964 was a big civil rights bill. So this is 15 years prior. That race relations laboratory of Harold Ickes, thankfully, turned out to be kind of a center stage success. That integration within the Jim Crow South could be done. Now, one thing before I wrap up and pass on to my colleague here is that Shenandoah has kind of always been within a bit of a spotlight. Not only are we one of the big 63 national parks, and we are a big one, 200,000 acres roughly, but we're also so close to DC, within 70 miles of DC. It has always been on the radar of politicians, of presidents. So doing something so drastic as fully reintegrating segregated areas within the 1950s, well before the civil rights movement came to a head, was astronomical. It showed other areas, federal or otherwise, that maybe this thing could be done. So we share this story. And what Allysah is going to show you is one of the phenomenal ways that we're able to put you in that story yourself. But we share this story because it's a controversial one. Controversy is never easy to talk about. This is never easy to talk about, but it is a vital part of who we are as Americans and who we are as a national park.
So this is on Shenandoah National Park's website. You can find it under our interactive features, and it's actually the 5th installment of one of the park stories that we share. In this park story, I am so proud of our park because we have owned this story since the beginning. Darwin Lambert, who was one of the first naturalists that worked for the park, he actually was the author of our administrative history that came out in the 70s, and he included this story. He wrote about Lewis Mountain and what the park did, cataloging it from the beginning of the park to present day. And so that was just something that I found so incredible that he thought to do. And we do have that administrative history on our iPad, and that's available on online as well if you just want to Google it. And he wrote it in a book that he authored called The Undying Past. Talks about Lewis Mountain history in here as well. So I just think that that's really incredible that we're not the first to tell this. He is. And so we just kind of took it to the finish line for him to make it more available to the public. And so we developed this interactive feature for students and teachers to use in the classroom. And the overarching theme is identifying agents of change. So who can create change? Who can make an impact? How does change happen? And part of that is by telling the whole story from every perspective. And so this first lesson especially talks about different perspectives by just analyzing photos. And each of the 5 lessons that we'll go through tonight are supported by the videos that we're going to watch tonight as well, just to give you a little bit of a background before we really dive deep into some of the lessons. So thankfully, Karl gave us a very in-depth and wonderful history. So we're going to start with our first lesson.
After the Civil War, formerly enslaved African Americans hoped to be recognized as equal citizens in American society. While some white Americans welcomed them, others spread and encouraged racial division. Legislation passed in the South, known as Jim Crow laws, ensured that Black and white people were separated in schools, jobs, and recreational spaces. Jim Crow laws created a segregated society that considered African Americans to be second-class citizens. In 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision ruled that racially separate facilities, if equal, were legal. However, in practice, separate facilities for African Americans were often inferior. The National Park Service had been aware since 1932 of the racial dilemmas they would face when opening Shenandoah National Park. Anybody, regardless of their race, was supposed to be welcomed into all national parks across the country. In 1935, Shenandoah was established with a gentleman's agreement that it would follow Virginia's Jim Crow laws. The Virginia Skyline Company, the park's concessionaire, was told to design and build a designated area for African Americans. The company's general manager resisted building these facilities, arguing it would be a distinct loss. However, they were forced to comply. The Lewis Mountain area was created under the supervision of Superintendent Ralph Lassiter, with conflicting pressure from Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes and Virginia Governor Harry F. Byrd Sr. Ickes pushed for desegregation in Shenandoah, while Byrd wanted to maintain the segregated customs of Virginia. Like these 3 men, Americans each had their own perspective on the race dilemma. Tensions ran high, and conflicts erupted throughout the South. Over the next 15 years, Shenandoah's segregated facilities became both a refuge for Black visitors looking for a safe place to vacation and a point of contention and anger over racial inequality and discrimination in the National Park Service.
So we're going to go through a series of photos. I bet some of these photos you have seen before. We're thinking that some of these students in classrooms maybe have not. And so the point of this activity is to analyze the photos that they are seeing on the screen. So for instance, this one is showing some of the signage in Shenandoah National Park during segregation. Asking the students if these signs surprise you. How would they affect your trip if you're in Shenandoah National Park? And what story do you think these photos tell? In this photo, clearly that is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but we wanted to talk more about the men that are surrounding him. And so we are asking the students to do a bit of their own research. So after we ask them what their first impression of the photo is, we also ask, what do you think the perspective of the photographer is? Why do they think this was an important moment to capture at that march? And then again, the photographer is Roland Sherman, and he's actually a photographer that is pretty well known. He was there when the Beatles first arrived in the US. He went to Woodstock, and he was at the March on Washington. So a lot of his photos you may have seen, and you just didn't know. And then there's someone in the crowd behind Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Matthew Almond. And so we asked students to do some research on him. And you'll notice he is white. And he's actually one of the 4 men that had the idea for the March on Washington. And so how does that change your perspective? And then we have Elizabeth Eckford arriving for her first day of school. Now, if you remember, this photo is from 1957 when the Little Rock Nine first arrived at high school. And so what's your impression of this photo? What do you think about the day was difficult for her? And then look at the other students in the background. What do you think their thoughts are? Why do they look so angry? And then we have 6-year-old Ruby Bridges arriving at her first day at her new school. So what do you think Ruby's parents were thinking when they sent her to school? Think they were scared? And then you look at the 3 men that are escorting her, who are U.S. Marshals. What did they think about the day? And then after the students have recorded all of their answers, it actually creates a PDF that they can save with their name and their answers, and they can submit to their teacher, and then they download it. So then the next story is about traveling in the Jim Crow era. So this is going to be largely about the Green Book and some of the struggles and conflict that African Americans faced when traveling during this era.
Because Jim Crow laws varied between states and counties, African Americans traveling through the South risked ending up in a place where they were not welcomed. Black travelers were often turned away from restaurants, gas stations, and hotels because of their race. It was not uncommon for travelers to face harassment or physical danger if they stopped in an unfriendly town. To alleviate some of this uncertainty, travelers relied on the Green Book. The Green Book was a travel guide first published in 1936 that identified businesses or recreational areas that accepted African Americans. In the mid-20th century, Shenandoah National Park became one of the most visited parks in the country. African American travelers comprised a small percentage of the total visitation to Shenandoah. A proposed picnic ground for African Americans at Lewis Mountain Park was in the master plan, but no such facility had materialized under the Virginia Skyline Company. By midsummer 1937, the Washington office, irked by the delay, sent a blunt reminder to Park Superintendent Ralph Lassiter. Portions of the new facility, called the Lewis Mountain Negro Area, opened in summer 1939. And the first cabins and lodge were in service the following summer. Lewis Mountain functioned as the site of annual Sunday school picnics, homecoming events, small gatherings, and other social activities. In several editions of the Green Book between 1947 and 1967, Shenandoah's Lewis Mountain was listed as a safe space for Black visitors looking for a similar experience in the park as everyone else. However, even after the director of the National Park Service eliminated the use of segregated terms in all park literature in 1940, African Americans were still met with ambiguity of certain areas in the park en route to their safe haven at Lewis Mountain. One area that was chosen as the inaugural area to extend non-discriminatory practices in the National Park Service was Pinnacle. Director of the National Park Service, Newton Drury, and Lassiter, on May 29, 1942, stated, "The Secretary agreed, however, that in Shenandoah National Park, we were to select one large picnic area, most conveniently located, and permit both races to use it. No signs indicating race segregation within the picnic grounds or in the comfort stations are permitted to be within this area. In all other picnic and campground areas in Shenandoah, signs are to indicate that they are for Negro and white visitors." Since it was not publicized where African Americans could go in the park, Superintendent Lassiter instructed rangers to identify where Black visitors were welcomed by pointing to Lewis Mountain on park maps. Several letters were written from Black and white visitors to the superintendent and Department of Interior in opposition of this so-called solution. During World War II, gasoline was rationed, visitation plummeted, and park concession facilities closed. To boost the nation's morale, a general bulletin to all National Park Service concessionaries was issued by the Washington office, calling attention to the Federal Register mandating full desegregation of all facilities in national parks. Gradually, the concessioner and Superintendent Freeland, Lassiter's successor, worked to ensure fully integrated facilities, a task accomplished in the summer of 1950, more than a decade before similar results in Virginia.
All right. So this next activity, I think we can do together. We are going to go on a trip. So in our trunk of our car, we have a couple of items, and we are supposed to select what items we think we need for our trip. So we have extra gas, tools and repair kit, the green book, blankets and pillows, a coffee can, and extra food and water. And so if you want to know why you are bringing any of those items, you can click on extra food and water. We have some inserts of a podcast called Driving the Green Book, which is available online for free, and we have incorporated those into this activity. It's people who experienced driving during Jim Crow law era, and they are sharing their experience and why some of these extra items might be necessary for a trip. So, do we want to select Route A and go to Washington, D.C., Gainesville, and Shenandoah National Park, or go through Frederick and then Harper's Ferry, then Shenandoah National Park?
Latter.
A. Any reasons why?
I've driven the roads in West Virginia.
Yeah. So the really neat thing about this activity is that you can actually flip through a green book. And so we're really hoping that the students will utilize this and look for look for those cities in this book and look for the safest route to go on their trip. So you can actually flip all through this thing. So let's go A. All right. So you've been driving for a few miles, but you're kind of running low on gas. And so you think you should fill up now, but what do you see? Do you find a service station in the green book, or do you stop at the first station that you see? Green book. That's probably a good idea. All right. So you all said that we should look in our green book. So then you can find a service station in your green book. It's in DC, so it takes you off course just a little bit, but you know that you're going to a safe station. And then you arrive at Shenandoah National Park. There's a ranger at the Front Royal entrance station that hands you a map, and you notice that Lewis Mountain is circled and a handwritten note for Negroes. That's odd. You heard from your friends in DC and Baltimore that other spaces in Shenandoah were integrated, but that map doesn't list them. So you just decide to drive south and head toward Lewis Mountain. So now it's lunchtime. Your family's getting hungry, but where do you stop to eat? You have the option to go to Pinnacles or the option to go to Panorama. But remember, there's nothing in your map that tells you where you can go. So what do you guys think we should do? Well, I will tell you it's not listed in the green book. So now what do you think we should do?
So now is the tough decision.
There is extra food, you're right. So let's go to Pinnacles because we did hear about that from some friends. So you arrive there, and again, there's nothing marked that says whites only, but there's also nothing marked that's saying you're welcome here. So you stop and you have lunch. But now you're enjoying your picnic and your son tugs at your sleeve that he needs to go to the restroom. So you take him to a conversation on the other side of the picnic. And it's on the side for the white visitors. And then he washes his hands, and as the two of you are heading back to your table, you overhear a woman yelling at a ranger, and she's pointing at you and your family. So now what do? Do you stay at the picnic area, or you pack up and leave? Pack up and leave? You want to avoid the conflict? You don't want to cause any trouble, so you pack up and continue to Lewis Mountain. So now you arrive at Lewis Mountain. So now we need to take time to reflect on our journey. Is this something that you think that you would recommend to your friends and family? Would you tell them to go the same route you did to get to Lewis Mountain? And so we ask the students to fill out that question. And then they submit that to their teacher. But it's just really interesting to see how you can see your road trip progress here, kind of relive what happened and really think about that. So now we are going to Lewis Mountain. And so this was one of my favorite interactives to develop because this was kind of the bright spot of it all. Because in spite of the reason why Lewis Mountain exists, it was still a safe haven for anyone that worked there, anyone that visited there. And most of the people that we talked to, they had so many positive things to say about it. And so that was just a really fun activity to work on and just to get to know the folks that really experienced it.
When African American travelers and locals became aware of the picnic grounds, lodge and dining room, and overnight accommodations at Lewis Mountain, the area began operating near full capacity and occasionally had to turn visitors away. Despite the claims of the Virginia Skyline Company that the development would not be profitable, visitation to Lewis Mountain persisted and thrived between the 1940s and 60s. Employees and guests were attracted to Lewis Mountain's relatively quiet atmosphere, natural setting, and fine dining. In 1941, Lloyd Tutt was recruited by Mr. Lakey of the Virginia Skyline Company to manage Lewis Mountain, where he stayed until the mid-1950s.
Mr. Lakey gave me just a few instructions, and then gave me total responsibility. Be sure there was no integration at Lewis Mountain. Keep control of the people. Be responsible for all the hiring and firing of the personnel. People came from Louisiana to Maine to stay at Lewis Mountain. Some were regulars who came back every year. Although I kept the lodge and campground segregated, people from Big Meadows and Skyland came to our dining room because of the food.
During Isabel Wright's time as the lodge's cook, she prepared the food folks would come near and far for. Her daughter, Beulah Billings, remembers the meals her sisters Gilda and Portia would serve to the tables.
Oh, steaks, meatloaf, chicken, baked chicken and fried chicken and barbecue chicken. But the main chicken was popular for was fried chicken. And all kind of vegetables and gratin potatoes and scallop potatoes. She had the blackberry pies and cherry pies and peach pie cobblers, you know. They were easier to handle when you had large groups.
Audrey Tutt worked in the lodge the summer of '58 under the management of her Aunt Mittie.
I waited tables. I went to the table, took the order on some days, go back to the kitchen, cook the food, put it on the tray, take it back, serve the people, clean the table, and wash the dishes.
Most employees stayed on the mountain for the duration of the season. In the evenings, staff might socialize with guests, play cards with return visitors they had come to know as friends, or sing and dance with the entertainers that frequented Lewis.
We had some of the biggest singers up there. They would come in there and have the biggest jubilee and dances and things that you ever heard of. It was a hopping joint.
The sounds of Lewis Mountain made it feel like home away from home. The younger children played baseball, jump rope, and tag, while older kids played ping pong on the porch of the lodge and listened to music on the jukebox inside. Others walked along the trails that wound through the woods. Throughout the day, parents wandered from table to table, getting acquainted with picnickers from other areas and making new friends. African American church groups, professional associations, and student organizations also chartered buses and socialized in the picnic grounds at Lewis Mountain well into the 1950s. Many guests returned to vacation at Lewis for years and established friendships with the staff working in the lodge and cabins. Lloyd can recall an unofficial visit from President Harry S. Truman with Chester Franklin, founder of The Call, which at the time was the most prominent African-American newspaper.
President Truman, with General Davis and their wives, visited there twice with Mr. Franklin, who was a guest at our lodge.
Robert Billings, a former staff member, also remembers the visit from the Franklins.
They came here with a family from Kansas City, and they just fell in love with the Shenandoah Valley and the mountains because they were visiting one of the other spots, and they went to Lewis Mountain, and then they came back every year to Lewis Mountain for years.
Although living and working at Lewis Mountain was a relatively isolated existence, most employees look back on the experience fondly. African American visitors from across the country and residents from surrounding communities took full advantage of the recreational facilities provided at Lewis Mountain. While the official status of the site changed during this period and the presence of white visitors became more and more common, Black visitors continued to visit Lewis Mountain. In time, this pattern of visitation would change.
I don't know if you noticed in that last picture of the Lewis Mountain area, you can still see Negro behind a lodge. They didn't do a very good job covering that up. So in this activity, you can listen to the oral histories of Columbus Tutt, Beulah Billings, Maxine Tutt, Shirley Ann Tutt McCoy, Elaine Blakey, and Audrey Tutt Smith. And so all of these people either worked there or visited there back in the heyday of Lewis Mountain, and they're quite extensive. I collected some of these existed because this project development began back in 2006. So this has been going on for quite some time. So we want the students to listen to those oral histories, and then they're going to write a letter home. So you can be a tourist at Lewis Mountain, you're with a church group at Lewis Mountain, or you're an employee there. And so you're writing a letter home about your experience based on the oral history information that you heard. So finally, in activities 4 and 5, we are going to talk about the agents of change. Now that you've heard a lot of the perspectives, a lot of the story about Lewis Mountain and how it came to be, you're going to figure out how change happened. The 2 videos are going to be talking about that, and there's a timeline activity that is pretty interesting that reinforces it.
We're here. We're here to not go back and bring the past back. We're not here to relive the past. You can't go back in the past and change nothing. The only way you can change the past is look ahead. I'm afraid that if I look back, I'm going to miss the opportunities right in front of my eyes. So we're not here to relive the past, but the past is very important because it's a gauge of where we were and where we're at. We all are a product of the past, but we don't have to be a prisoner of the past. We got to look ahead.
Understanding the past, both good and bad, is essential to understanding ourselves as a culture and understanding how change occurs, especially when that change improves lives, is essential to cultural growth. A lot has changed since the first enslaved people arrived in America in 1619. Almost immediately, abolitionists attempted to point out the inhumanity of slavery. But social change comes slowly, and despite the steady growth of the abolitionist movement, it took 2.5 centuries and a civil war before Congress finally outlawed slavery in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. Even then, Southern states retaliated, passing Jim Crow laws that legalized discrimination and marginalized African Americans. It took another century and more gradual social change before Congress acted to protect the rights of Black people with a series of civil rights legislation. Shenandoah National Park's history regarding segregation and desegregation mirrored the same struggles as the rest of the nation. That struggle for Shenandoah was rooted in the conflict between Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes and Virginia Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr. Ickes, a longtime supporter of African American rights, and Byrd, an avowed segregationist and the driving force behind the establishment of Shenandoah National Park, collided bitterly over how African Americans would experience the park. Eventually, social change with regard to civil rights for African Americans won out, and Shenandoah was, by National Park Service policy, fully integrated in 1950. Although important and essential laws and policies have passed as a result of those who spoke up for change, true social change must come from the human heart. Social change often occurs when individuals decide to work towards a common goal. They take note of what's destructive or inefficient in society and take the steps necessary to change it. Most activists can point to a specific movement or person from the past that inspires them. Think about the history of race equality in the United States and the centuries of social change that have occurred. What or who was responsible for the change? Was it abolitionists in the 1700s? The Underground Railroad? Politicians? Was it the Civil War or civil disobedience? Was it massive movements like the March on Washington? Social change continues today, but it often comes gradually. What changes do you see coming? Will you work toward the change you'd like to see? What would inspire you to be a part of that change?
So now we're going to identify the agents of change. And so in this activity, we provide a timeline of events, starting with the first slaves that arrived in North America in 1619. And we go through a bit of history and a bit of review for the interactive. And so you can choose 3 events or 3 people on this timeline that you think had the most impact on change in regards to civil rights. We can go all the way through here. You choose 3 of them. We decided to end the timeline in 1968 when the Green Book was no longer published. And this is one of my I don't want to say favorite quotes, but most profound, it really stuck with me, is Victor Hugo Green, who was the author of the Green Book. He published this in every edition of the Green Book. And so we chose to end our timeline with this quote. There will be a day sometime in the near future when this guide will not have to be published. That is when we as a race will have equal opportunities and privileges in the United States. It will be a great day for us to suspend this publication, for then we can go wherever we please and without embarrassment. So then for each of the agents that you chose, you write why, what behind your choice of that event or that person. And now finally, telling the whole story. So now you've heard all the perspectives, you have your own perspective. Now you have to share it with the world.
During World War II, visitation to Shenandoah plummeted. Virginia Skyline Company facilities closed and did not reopen until September 1945. After 13 years as Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickey's final act in office was quietly integrating the national parks and facilities operated by concessionaires. News reached Virginia Skyline by a general bulletin from Washington, drawing attention to the December 8, 1945 Federal Register. Tyler McCall Frazier, Virginia Skyline Company's vice president, protested to Superintendent Freeland. This company was assured that the facilities at Dickey Ridge, Elk Wallow, Skyland, and Big Meadows would be reserved for the exclusive use of white people. The Lewis Mountain development has always carried the designation for the exclusive use of Negroes. Instead of improving racial relations, it would be a distinct disservice to the Negroes desiring to visit the park. Ickey's insisted that the concessionaire comply with the new regulation. Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr. assured Frazier that it was okay to continue segregated practices during the 1946 season. However, Frazier resigned shortly after this exchange. By 1947, the Department of the Interior had drafted standard language for concessionaire contracts that prohibited discrimination in public accommodations within the parks, as well as discrimination in hiring and employment practices. For the first time, the National Park Service expanded desegregation. Although the Virginia Skyline Company's contract did not include a line prohibiting racial discrimination, the company eventually agreed to abide by the rules and regulations of the Park Service. Superintendent Edward Freeland recalled, "We eased in gradually, getting whites and blacks more accustomed to associating with each other. Some middle executives of Virginia Skyline Company helped greatly." By 1950, Superintendent Freeland openly affirmed that every area of Shenandoah National Park was open to all visitors, 14 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Quoting Freeland, "The national parks are public property and are set aside for the enjoyment and equal opportunity of all." Meanwhile, Virginia was struggling. Through much of the 1950s, the Byrd Organization, a Virginia political machine headed by Senator Byrd, wielded incredible power and influence. Byrd and his massive resistance movement devoted much of their time keeping segregation a prominent item on their political agenda and fighting federally mandated desegregation. Byrd was concerned that one or more local school districts might integrate, creating a domino effect that would lead to integration across the entire South. The Stanley Plan, enacted through the Virginia Assembly in 1956, was a direct response to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Named for the 57th Virginia Governor, Thomas B. Stanley, the Stanley Plan greatly slowed the pace of desegregation in Virginia, forbidding state funds to public schools that allowed mixing of races, and eventually closing 9 schools under the authority of 58th Virginia Governor James Lindsay Almond. By 1959, the Virginia Supreme Court deemed the Stanley Plan a direct violation of the Virginia Constitution. Governor Almond declared, "Virginia has not surrendered and does not surrender now," but then said he would not use the police power of the state to try to force schools to stay segregated. This was an obvious reference to President Dwight Eisenhower when he placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control and had 9 students escorted into Little Rock Central High School in 1957. The immediate areas around Shenandoah National Park would see similar effects for their black students. The Andrew Jackson School in Luray, named for a local black entrepreneur, was attended by many of the employees at Lewis Mountain. This school for black residents was built in the 1920s with support from the Rosenwald Fund, which helped build about 5,000 schools for African Americans in the South. However, the Andrew Jackson School only offered education through the 11th grade. Black students who wanted to complete their high school education had to move to northern urban areas like New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and New York. Numerous Luray students who migrated north to complete their educations also sought employment in those areas, not returning to their hometown. In 1946, the black community formed the New York Virginia Club to welcome home those that had moved away in an annual homecoming celebration that continues today. In the early years, one of the homecoming's main events was a picnic at Lewis Mountain, a double homecoming for those who had worked there. As late as 1964, Lewis Mountain continued to be the only National Park Service facility listed in the Green Book in the entire state of Virginia. Those that experienced life at Lewis Mountain, whether through recreation or employment, made the history that educates us today. Their memories, their stories shared in this program paint the picture of the past, a picture of resilience and cultural change. The spirit of Lewis is present during annual homecomings and those who return to their roots, now thankfully without the Green Book. Although there is still work to be done, we can be grateful for the agents of change who have made a difference and those who continue to strive for inclusivity.
All right, so in this activity, you're going to design a wayside panel. And so that's a term that we use a lot because we work in the visual media office. And I know a lot of you have visited Shenandoah National Park. So if you've been to an overlook or if you've been to an exhibit, there are typically panels available there that give you a little bit of information and a little bit of interpretive history. And so we're inviting the students to design a wayside panel. And here are some examples that we have. For instance, this one's at Lewis Mountain in the campground area there right now. And we're inviting the students to design one about life at Lewis Mountain and how African Americans experienced the park during Jim Crow, or they can write about the history of civil rights in America using Shenandoah as an example, or social change through the lens of segregation and desegregation in the park. So once you choose a theme, you can choose a panel style, and then you can choose images, titles, and then write the history that you want to share. And then there's a preview of it. And these are the submissions that I'm hoping to get from the teachers. And then maybe one day a student might have this wonderful idea and we can put it up in the park. That's just a dream, but I think it'll happen eventually. We've got some bright students out there. But that is our interactive in a nutshell. I invite you to explore this on your own. It is available on our website. So if you just want to type in the search bar, Lewis Mountain, this will show up. And I want to thank you all again for coming here tonight. I know we've run past a little bit, but we'll stick around if anyone has any questions.
Grade level this is projected.
So this is middle school to high school.
If I was driving through the park and I was an African American and I came to one of these overlooks where you can stop the car, were African Americans allowed to stop there and get out and look at the scenery in that area or not?
So, wonderful question. Legally, absolutely. The overlook Skyline Drive itself was not segregated. So any of those scenic views, they could. Now, culturally, socially, there's still that stigma. If there's a white family stop there, me as an African American family, I might decide to catch the next overlook. So while there was no legal basis withholding that from them, I'm sure there were certainly instances of kind of that stigma keeping them from doing so. Great question. Yeah.
In your experience, with your experience in Yellowstone, did they have a similar situation with Native Americans?
Marvelous question. Again, every question is great, and I'll say that a lot. But so the question was, if you didn't hear it, if you were here last week, you heard a bit of my story. I've worked at other parks out west. Most of those national parks, places like Yellowstone, were not inherently segregated. However, the question is if places like Yellowstone experience similar stigma as far as like Native American went. Not necessarily. And that's because, during the time of those parks becoming parks, again, we're talking 1872 for Yellowstone, Native Americans were already kind of enclosed within reservations. Native American visitation really wasn't a thing. Now, today, and I actually had a conversation with the school group earlier today about this as we were talking about Lewis Mountain, but today, I'm sure you see in the news changes brought about on public lands that are historically Native American with name changes, things of that nature. So now the National Park Service, I say now, over the past several decades, are starting to recognize the importance of those Native heritages. For example, in some areas, Yellowstone included, Native American communities of the nearby reservations are allowed to hunt in certain areas. Or when bison, for example, are culled, which happens out at Yellowstone on occasion, that meat is donated to those communities. Additionally, places like formerly named Mount McKinley is now named Mount Denali because of that Native heritage. So while we didn't really, these other national parks didn't see anything quite to this extent with Native American communities, there are a lot of other similar injustice issues and historic issues that are now starting to go through these changes related to those communities. Yes, sir.
Well, my question kind of builds on her. Between 45 and 1950, how closely were other park superintendents in the South looking at the Shenandoah experience and saying, we've got to do something? Or was this an isolated situation, or was it kind of permeating the park system?
I think that's a great question. So Shenandoah National Park was used as an experiment. So Pinnacle's Picnic Ground was the first location in all the National Park Service to be used as an integrated space to kind of see how that relationship would go. And so I would venture to guess that there was catching attention. I'm sure that there were other superintendents that were paying attention to this. Now, in terms of how much control they had over that change, that's kind of hard to say, just because that's one of the things that we wanted students to think about is maybe you don't have the same perspective. You are okay with the area being integrated, but you're being told by someone higher than you that you have to keep everything separate. So I think that there were just a lot of situations out of their control, but certainly I'm sure that they were keeping a close eye on Shenandoah's changes. I guess the mountain was named Lewis. I don't know. We have Lewis Falls. We have. That's a great question.
For those of you, and especially those of you that are here at next week's and learning about the former resident history of the park, so many of the names in the park have been lost to time because they're family names of people that were once there. So yeah, the Lewises, whoever they were prolific. They had Lewis Mountain, they had Lewis Falls. The one I've always been curious about is Naked Creek. And I haven't gotten an answer for that one, but I don't know the answer.